When you're in need of help, you need experience and talent to fight for you. The educational background and accomplishments of our attorneys are what make Bordas & Bordas a premier law firm. In law, experience and talent are what matter most. Bordas & Bordas, fighting for justice.
I'm Jamie Bordas. Each episode we talk to you about issues affecting our area, our state, and our nation. On our last show we talked about gun control and the Constitution and how it affects the right to control guns by the government. Chris Regan was with me. He's here again today, and we're going to continue talking about that discussion now that some of the things have taken place regarding gun control. Chris, thanks for being on the show again here today.
Great to be here, Jamie.
You know, last time we were here, we talked about the fact that the Second Amendment has certain provisions that relate to guns, and we analyzed that. But now some things have started to take place both on the federal level and on the state level. Let's start off by talking about what's going on at the federal level. There's been a lot of discussion about what President Obama has done, what he is allowed to do, what he's not allowed to do. And a lot of people maybe have a little bit of confusion in their minds as to what can the president do on his own, what does he need Congress to do, and what has happened so far. So let's start off talking about what can the president do on his own?
Well, the Constitution charges the president with the duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. And you'll notice, of course, that executing the laws is different from making the laws. And so the president, via his power to direct the enforcement of the laws through the U.S. Attorney's offices and the Department of Justice, and his power to issue executive orders, is not a law-making power, but rather a law-enforcing power. And so already we've seen President Obama has issued a number of executive orders, but these are not quite what some people appear to think that they are. For example, President Obama cannot and has not issued an order saying, I'm going to reinstate the assault weapons ban, or I'm going to reclassify certain weapons as illegal to own in the United States, or even I'm going to make certain magazine sizes illegal. None of that, I don't think, is within the reach of the executive order power. And President Obama has not issued executive orders on those topics. The orders he's issued have been much more innocuous than that, much more low level in their effect, and really have to do with the way we enforce existing laws, which is proper. That is what the president is supposed to do, to direct the priorities and the manner in which the laws we already have are being enforced.
All right. So, I mean, for those that are saying President Obama's taking away people's guns, I mean, that just hasn't happened.
That has not happened at this time, Jamie. I mean, the executive orders we've seen have to do with enforcing rules we already have regarding background checks. There have been an executive order saying that we need to start a campaign on gun safety. There has been an executive order on the issue of whether or not certain mental health provisions that we have in relation to gun ownership are going to be enforced. There's been the appointment of a director for the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, something we've been without for 6 years. There's been another executive order that indicates that we want to make sure that, to the extent we already have laws preventing certain types of dangerous individuals from owning guns, that all levels of law enforcement know who those people are. Basically orders for these state agencies and federal agencies to begin talking to one another and for background check information to be shared across different levels of government. But nothing dramatic like changing what types of weapons you can own, or where you can buy them, or what types of ammunition or magazines or accessories you can purchase. None of that is affected by the orders that have been issued so far, Jamie.
Chris, when it comes down to things like that, about the types of weapons you can buy or the size of the magazines, things like that, what would be needed in order for something like that to be put in place?
Well, at the federal level, that type of change is going to be an act of Congress. Without an act of Congress, the federal assault weapons ban, for example, that was in existence, I think, from 1994 to about 2004, can't go back into effect. And I think the president recognizes that, and I think Congress recognizes that. Senators and congressmen are already staking out their positions on whether or not that's a step we're going to take. But it isn't going to happen unless you have a bill passed by both houses of Congress and signed by the president.
When the president issues an executive order, I mean, a lot of people may not know even what that is. I mean, what does that mean? Is that a law then, when he issues an executive order, or is it just him telling people, hey, do this because I'm the president?
Well, it essentially has the force of regulation, which is a lower level than the law, because if you were to be pulled into court on a regulation, if those regulations conflict with the law, then those regulations don't have effect. That's a defense to the violation of a regulation, that it conflicts with an existing law of the United States. However, the president, through executive orders, which is just a piece of paper that he writes up and signs, I mean, that's how it works mechanically, it does have the force of a regulation, which means it is the executive's interpretation of the laws we already have. And transgressing those boundaries can, in some cases, constitute a criminal act. You usually see that more in the area of environmental regulation and not in the area of these executive orders. None of these executive orders purport to make anything a crime, which once again requires an underlying law that it be based on that Congress has passed.
Let's say that the president would issue an executive order that exceeds his scope of authority for issuing executive orders. That's something that should really be done by Congress, as you just described. If that happens, I mean, who determines that hey, this is not within his executive powers to issue such an order, and how does it get challenged then?
Well, I mean, that's sort of our classic American government. Jamie, a dispute between two different branches of government over the scope of their respective authorities is going to be decided in the courts. So, if there was an overreach on the part of the president, if he, for example, tried to reinstitute the assault weapons ban via regulation, then there would immediately be a lawsuit filed in federal court by some person affected by the ban, seeking a declaratory judgment that the president had exceeded the scope of his authority. And if that was the particular case, if it was the assault weapons ban, for example, that would be a winner. You'd probably see an immediate injunction against the enforcement of the president's order, and then subsequently a trial and a decision by the court that no, that goes too far and beyond the president's power.
So if, for example, that the president did issue some type of executive order banning assault weapons, without Congress being involved, he just did it on his own, then Joe Smith, who lives here in West Virginia, could go ahead and file a lawsuit saying that the president can't do that?
Sure. If he was affected by that, if he had wanted to own the weapon, or if the order proposed to take away his weapons, then he would be able to seek that. Yes, a declaration that government action imminently harmed him, threatened to harm him imminently by depriving him of his rights, and that it was not a lawful action, that it exceeded the scope of the president's authority. And
then initially, I guess then one of our federal judges sitting here locally, such as Judge Bailey or Judge Stamp, could decide that issue.
That's right. That could definitely be decided. Now, sometimes, the courts require more or less enforcement action before they're willing to take on an issue like that. For example, maybe the minute the ink is dry on the president's order, some judges would go ahead and tackle that right away in a preliminary fashion. Other judges might wait until some enforcement action had been taken against a person pursuant to the president's order. In other words, until they actually tried to deprive you of your weapon or cited you for owning a weapon that had become illegal. Only then would some judges be willing to say we have a real controversy in play that could be decided under Article 3 of our Constitution.
And then, how long does that take to typically get through the court system? I mean, that's something that I would think that would probably ultimately make its way to the United States Supreme Court. Something that's as hot of a topic as whether the president exceeded his authority, and it'd probably be fast tracked. I would think it wouldn't be fall under the normal standards for years and years where it takes cases to get to that type of level.
Yeah, I think we kind of just saw that with the controversy over Obamacare. I mean, it took about 2.5 to 3 years to get to the Supreme Court there. I mean, that is really kind of the fast track. A lot of times a case can take many more years than that to wind through the federal courts. But in the meantime, there are remedies available like temporary injunctions or permanent injunctions that prevent the enforcement of laws that appear to be unconstitutional. And that's also a result that could happen. If the president were to overstep his authority, which I think it's important that we emphasize, that has yet to occur. The executive orders that have been issued so far are innocuous. They mostly call for the issuing of, as I say, memorandum, communication between agencies, getting somebody in there at ATF to run the place. There's nothing in there about taking away anybody's guns, anybody's ammunition, or anybody's magazines, yet.
Well, a number of these things in the executive orders, pertain directly to some of the things that happened in Newtown. I mean, there's an executive order that's been issued that we need to look into how schools can be provided incentives to have a resource officer at the school. We need to look at incentives for other things pertaining to school safety. We need to look at ways in which we can test to make sure that gun-safe locks are properly manufactured, to make sure that they really are they do lock and keep people that shouldn't have them from getting into them. So a lot of those things like that, I don't think anybody really has a problem with, but it's just been spun so much in the media as President Obama is trying to take away our guns, and it's really not the case.
Well, I mean, it's a question of the intensity of our politics in some respects, Jamie. I mean, as you point out, a lot of folks on the right in America are calling for better mental health checks and better enforcement of existing gun laws. And that's exactly what a number of the executive orders issued by the president are trying to do. And yet, just because of the level of intensity at which our politics seems to be conducted, you have folks saying, no, we need to impeach the president over these orders that, if you read them, are really fairly innocuous so far.
One of the things that's interesting is that with the president now beginning his second term here, a lot of people think, well, gosh, he's going to do whatever he wants because this is his last term. He doesn't have to run for re-election. But even as a president who's in his second term certainly has to be concerned about his party's future as well. And also he's bound by this. Is of course an educated man who's risen to the level of president. He understands what he can and can't do, and there are also people around him that are advising him, and I think he has a pretty good understanding as to what he can and can't do. But he also may try to convince Congress to do some of the things that he'd like to see done in order to perhaps improve gun safety and to keep weapons from getting in the hands of the wrong people.
Well, I think that's something that we all want to see. I mean, I think everybody recognizes that there has to be some reasonable limitations on who can possess, dangerous instrumentalities, including semi-automatic weapons and whether it be pistols or long guns. And there's agreement on that. The question is, how do we go about it? And you'd like to have a more productive discussion than when we're having so far.
Well, we're going to take a break here. When we come back, we'll talk about what some of the states are already doing, particularly New York, in order to try to enact some type of legislation and put measures in place to improve gun safety. And we'll talk about that after the break here, Chris.
When you're in need of help, you need experience and talent to fight for you. The educational background and accomplishments of our attorneys are what make Bordas & Bordas a premier law firm. In law, experience and talent are what matter most. Bordas & Bordas, fighting for justice.
Welcome back to the Bordas & Bordas Legal Review. I'm Jamie Bordas. We're talking today about gun control and follow up to our last episode where we were talking about the Second Amendment of the Constitution and how it affects the ability of people to own guns. And Chris Regan's with me again today. And Chris, we've been talking so far about some of the things that the federal government's done, particularly President Obama issuing some executive orders. But let's turn to the states. New York has already done some things here in the aftermath of the tragedy in Newtown, Connecticut, and they've taken some steps to try to put some stronger gun and safety measures in place. What's been done so far in New York, and what gives the states the right to do that?
Well, there are the states. First of all, let me take your last question first. The states have the right to enact constitutional provisions regulating guns through the general police power, the same way that a state can enact the speed limits, set the sentence or parameters of robbery or burglary or other crimes. States have the ability to reasonably regulate the possession of firearms. And this is something the Supreme Court upheld in the Heller decision that we talked about in our last show. New York is kind of out in front after Newtown of enacting the first major comprehensive sort of reaction to the Newtown shootings with specific regulations. And some of the regulations that New York has enacted are very familiar. They include tightening the assault weapons ban, enacting it at the state level. And the assault weapons ban has always been a restriction on certain types of semi-automatic firearms that have certain what are called military-style features. And these are sometimes considered cosmetic features of weapons, but include things like a bayonet mount, a threaded barrel that would allow you to attach a silencer or a flash suppressor, a pistol-style grip, a folding or collapsible stock. In the case of handguns, it can include magazines that extend beyond the grip of the weapon. Various, also a threaded barrel on a handgun. Various features, and it used to be under the federal rules that if you had 2 or more military-style features, then you could be covered under the assault weapons ban. Well, New York reduced that to 1. So within the boundaries of the state of New York, a weapon with one or more military style features meeting other certain basic criteria. Also certain heavy handguns, a handgun over 1.4, I believe, kilograms of unloaded weight, can be considered an assault weapon, and those are banned in New York. They're not to be possessed anywhere within the state of New York. But that's sort of the familiar thing. They also limited clip size to 7, no magazines that can hold more than 7 bullets. But there's another regulation that New York has gone in the direction of that I think is really interesting and different from what we've had in the country in the past, though.
Well, we'll talk about that in a minute, but let's talk about the things that you just mentioned so far. I mean, with respect to these military-style weapons, I mean, a lot of people say, why in the world does any individual need to have a military-style weapon anyway? I mean, where you can have more than 7 in the magazine, why you can have more than, where you've got these, silencers and flash suppressors, things like that. I mean, why do people need to have those anyway?
Well, I've heard that question asked, Jamie, and the most persuasive answer that I hear out there from people in answer to that question is, kind of, it's none of your business. A lot of folks who want to own those types of weapons, who already own those types of weapons, don't believe that it's anyone's business to ask them why they want to own it or what they intend to do with it, provided that they're not out committing crimes with it. And what those folks have to say about that is that this is a free country, and that under the Second Amendment they have the right to keep and bear arms, of which those are some, and that it's simply no one's business why they want to do that. It'd be the very, very same thing to them if you said, in regard to someone's writing a book, why do you want to write that kind of book? Why do you need to write that kind of book? And they're offended by it. They're offended by the idea that their exercise of their rights is subject to somebody else's questioning as to why they would even bother to do that.
There's also been some people who have said, the reason that, one of the reasons anyway, that this Second Amendment was put into the Constitution was because to allow people to defend themselves from government oppression. And gosh, how can we protect ourselves from the government if we don't have these military-style weapons when the government has at its disposal an army that has all these military-style weapons? And that, that's an argument that resonates with some people.
It absolutely does. And I think people are somewhat simplified in their reasoning about that, too. I mean, I've heard a lot of folks say, what's the point of having, weapons, even assault weapons, to defend yourself against the United States government when the United States government has aircraft carriers and submarines and ultimately nuclear weapons. But, people who are students of armed conflict are familiar with the Vietnam War. They're familiar with the war in Afghanistan that's still going on, and understand that it is absolutely possible to resist even vastly superior military power when you have an armed population that is determined to resist that power. And it's happening right now. And accordingly, those folks who believe that the Second Amendment was enacted to protect the citizens from tyranny, a potentially tyrannical government. We, of course, founded our country resisting the tyrannical government of the United Kingdom, or it was not the United Kingdom at that time, but Britain. They feel that that's what these weapons are for, and it's not as impractical as some people suggest. Now, the other question, though, is that was a government in which we had no representation, the government of Great Britain and King George. We had no representation in that government. Of course, in the government we have now that would be enacting these gun control regulations, presumably through Congress, we do have representation, and that's a pretty substantial difference.
Chris, I want to turn to the other point that you were making with respect to the New York law. I mean, you said there are some components of it that are very different than just the ban on the assault weapons. What's the other component that's different that you're talking about?
Well, the thing they enacted that I find particularly fascinating, Jamie, has to do with relicensing and registration of guns every 5 years. That's part of New York's new program, and that's something that we've simply not seen. I can tell you from my own experience, I live here in West Virginia. I own several weapons. When I purchased them, I was subject to the federal regulations of background check and certain registration forms that had to be filled out to purchase those weapons. However, since I purchased them many, many years ago now, nobody checks up on me. Nobody checks up to see what I've done with those weapons. Nobody checks up on me to see how I'm doing. So even to the extent there was a threshold check when I purchased the weapons to see, are you crazy? Are you a felon? Are you, and I'm not. I feel like I should mention that. But even though they checked when I bought them, nobody checks to see what happens later on. And nobody has checked to see, do I still own them? Have you sold them? Do you keep them in your house? Where are these weapons? There's no process in place once the point of sale is passed, historically, to really keep tabs on any except the most sophisticated weapons that are out there. There are some people who own actual automatic weapons pursuant to a certain federal license that get tracked on that. But other than that, once the weapon is sold, it's out there, it goes into the world, and it lives its own life. And New York's trying to change that with registration and relicensing every 5 years. And that's very significant, particularly in terms of how Newtown developed, I think.
Well, with respect to that, Chris, I mean, the weapons, for example, that you purchased, many years ago, if you go to resell those to a friend or an acquaintance or something like that, I mean, is there any record of that?
No, that's the private sale loophole that you hear talked about on TV, that they're, as a private seller of one firearm from one private citizen to another, it would be no different than selling, your television or some piece of equipment from your kitchen, your barbecue, whatever it is. That's a cash transaction. The background check doesn't occur. The forms, federal forms aren't filled out. There's no registration of the transaction. It's much harder to transfer your vehicle and much more carefully tracked than it is to transfer a semi-automatic weapon in this country. I mean, your vehicle has a title. If you sell it, it has to be signed. It has to be sent into the state so you can get a new title in the name of the new owner. Your vehicle's registered. It has a license plate. It has an inspection sticker on it. With weapons, we simply don't have any of that ongoing tracking after the point of sale, which is notable.
So what exactly has New York done in order to try to help with this situation?
Well, they're going to be renewing, requiring of someone to apply for and obtain a renewal of the license to own certain types of firearms every 5 years. So, I mean, with respect to Newtown, we know that these weapons weren't owned by the shooter. They were owned by his mother. The question may be asked when those weapons were acquired. When they went into her home, perhaps her son was not a mentally unstable individual. But perhaps if she goes periodically and has to renew her license, if there's a question that's asked, do you live in a household with any mentally unstable individuals, and you check yes on that, well, maybe that's something where on an ongoing basis we're looking into what's happening with those weapons in our country.
But realistically, I mean, what's to keep someone from saying, no, I don't. I mean, everybody in my house is just fine. I mean, the government's not going to actually give people mental health exams in order to, and particularly not going to give everyone in their household mental health exams in order to determine that. So really, are the measures really going to have any effect?
Well, there's no panacea, Jamie. There's no perfect system, but we do have lists of people at the state level and at the federal level who are, potentially subject to commitment for mental health problems. And if you start cross-checking these lists, if you get everybody into the same computer database, it's possible you'll catch some situations that need to be looked into. Now, a lot of people object to that. They don't want to be on any government list. They don't want us to be tracking these things. But given the types of things that can happen and the magnitude of the tragedy, the stakes are there where I think maybe we do want to have some tracking of who owns these weapons and who are in the households where these weapons are owned, who might come into contact with them.
Yeah, and there's a real debate right now in our country as to whether or not this is really a gun issue or whether it's a mental health issue or whether it's some other issue. I don't know that I can solve that answer. Maybe it's a little bit of everything. Maybe we need a little bit better gun safety measures. Maybe we need a little bit better mental health checks on people that are obtaining weapons. But I think certainly it's good that our government's examining this because it's been too long. I mean, as you said, the assault weapons ban expired, almost a decade ago, and really it took, unfortunately, a tragedy like this to really bring it back to the surface and to have our government examining what should we be doing and what's right and what's not. I mean, certainly people should be able to have guns to hunt and protect themselves. I don't think anybody really debates that too strenuously. But also, there are certain things the gun should not be used for, and how can we prevent that from happening if we can?
I'm with you, Jamie, and I think left or right, I mean, people need to answer this question. If the issue is keeping guns away from the mentally ill, then we're going to need to keep track of who are the mentally ill and where are the weapons. I mean, if we don't know that, how does anyone propose to keep weapons away from the mentally ill? So I think somebody, both on left and right, need to come together and come up with a plan for keeping these types of weapons away from the severely mentally ill people who perpetrated these shootings in Newtown and Aurora and in many that have gone before.
Well, Chris, thanks for being here on the show once again today and examining this issue. I mean, we've talked now about the Second Amendment. We've talked about how now some of these measures are being put in place to hopefully prevent tragedies like this from happening again. So I appreciate you being here on the show.
Well, thanks for having me, Jamie.
And thanks to all of you for being with us today for another episode of the Bordas & Bordas Legal Review. We appreciate you joining us. We'll see you again next week.